United States President Donald Trump brazenly lashed out at European leaders with insults, stating that Putin should not have been excluded from the G8. After all, it was resentment over this decision that made the Kremlin dictator start the war against Ukraine. Trump demonstratively dropped documents about the trade agreement with Britain on the ground, refused to sign the final communiqué of the summit, and in the end simply left the G7 summit. He refused to meet with leaders of other countries, including the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky. It took United States President Donald Trump just a few hours of high-level talks in the Canadian woods where the summit was held to decide that he would rather be somewhere else. Let's take a look at why Trump behaved this way at the G7 summit and whether the real reason for his departure was the war in the Middle East. My name is Alexei Pechi. Let's go through everything step by step, but before we start, I ask you to subscribe to this channel, like the video, leave any comment, and be sure to subscribe to my Telegram channel, Peachy News. The link is in the description of this video where we post breaking news as it comes in. So, returning to Washington on a night flight, Trump explained his decision to suddenly stop participating in the G7 summit by citing operational security concerns, saying that at the summit in Canada there were too many, as he put it, curious ears eavesdropping on his secret conversations. Quote, "I don't trust phones because people like you listen to them." That's what he told reporters on board. "It's much better to be at the scene, and we've done everything I was supposed to do." End of quote. Well, basically, that was just the first public insult from Donald Trump towards the allies, because he directly states that he doesn't trust partners and allies because they might be eavesdropping on his conversations about the situation in the Middle East. But did Trump do everything he planned at the G7 summit? Not quite. As European sources state, quote, "not quite everything that his colleagues had planned for him." At the first international event of his second term, where attempts to avoid an open rift were almost immediately thwarted. At the moment when Trump first appeared before the cameras to object to the 11-year-old decision to exclude Russia from the group, Trump immediately showed that Putin was closer to him than his allies. Post office now. And now, after returning to Washington on Tuesday, Trump planned to meet with national security officials in the White House Situation Room to discuss the situation in the Middle East. He said that flying home he is seeking a real end to the conflict, not just a ceasefire. And he described himself as, quote, "not too eager for negotiations." His vice president, Juris Dr. Wenz, wrote that Trump, quote, "may decide that he needs to take further action to end uranium enrichment in Iran, hinting at increased United States involvement in the escalation of the Israeli-Iranian conflict." Well, after that, Trump published a series of daytime posts on the platform, which turned out to take a more threatening stance toward Iran, noting that the United States knows the whereabouts of Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, and calling for unconditional surrender. Although initially he positioned his departure from Alberta, where the G7 summit was taking place, as a matter of utmost urgency. Upon returning to Washington, Trump told reporters that Israel's intentions would become clearer within the next 2 days. Well, if there was any inevitable and specific reason for his sudden departure from the summit, he and his aides did not disclose it. And Trump himself, already in Washington, admitted that there was actually no urgency to his departure at all. If anything was clear, it was Trump's conviction that the Middle East crisis would not be resolved at the summit in Canada, even though he was surrounded by his foreign colleagues. Trump apparently did not attach much importance to this idea of collective action, believing that his decisions and only his decisions could determine the fate of the Middle East. It is very important to note here that a very interesting final communiqué was supposed to be signed at the end of the summit. And just a day earlier, European leaders were trying to finalize a joint statement by the leaders calling for de-escalation between Israel and Iran. And they faced resistance from United States officials who objected to some of the wording in the draft and made it clear that Trump would not sign it. By the time the leaders' dinner took place on Monday evening, a few hours after Trump announced he was leaving a day early, some of the wording in the statement had been softened. So, according to two American officials, after some urging from his colleagues at dinner, Trump said, "Okay, I'll sign this communiqué." But when he returned to Washington, Trump seemed uninterested in the details of this communiqué at all. Moreover, Trump said that he hadn't even read the final document of the summit at all, and he didn't care what was written in it. Well, as it turned out later, Trump was actually hesitant about whether he should attend. This week, the organizers made every effort to adjust the schedule and expectations according to Donald Trump's preferences. And instead of a lengthy joint communiqué that was supposed to be released following the summit, shorter statements on individual topics were prepared, in the hope that a few contentious lines wouldn't ruin a more concise display of unity. And instead of overloading the agenda with back-to-back group sessions, which even presidents before Trump called exhausting, time was set aside for more lively individual meetings that would allow the leaders to interact informally with Donald Trump. As the Europeans said, the goal was simple: not to let Trump get bored, because many European officials believe that's exactly when a disaster can happen. And so Trump's aides announced before the summit began that foreign leaders were eager to meet with him, partly to present their arguments in favor of trade agreements that would help avoid the introduction of new tariffs next month. Let me remind you, at the beginning of July, the 90-day pause on trade tariffs comes to an end, which was specifically set aside for signing new trade agreements. And indeed, it really must be admitted that many leaders lined up to talk to Trump about this issue. Prime Minister of Canada, Mark Carney, started by congratulating Trump on his birthday. On the 14th, he turned 79 years old. And other leaders came, armed with gifts. Antonio Costa, President of the European Council, gifted Trump a Portugal national team jersey autographed by football star Cristiano Ronaldo. And then something rather strange happens. Trade is the topic for which Trump actually came to Canada, and it was indeed discussed a lot. After Trump had avoided Ursula von der Leyen for several months, he finally met with her while they were working out the terms of a trade deal. On the other hand, Trump was eager to showcase a new trade pact with the United Kingdom, although he mistakenly took it for an agreement with the European Union. And then there was an awkward moment when Trump, whether intentionally or not, while showing this trade agreement to journalists, simply dropped it on the ground. And this shot that you're seeing now has spread all over the world. When Trump drops the trade agreement with Britain and the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Keir Starmer, picks it up from the ground and simply says, "This is actually a very important document." But all this individual tension wasn't enough to keep Donald Trump in Canada. By midday on the first day, aides realized he wanted to leave early. The crisis in the Middle East occupied the president, who kept asking for updates during meetings. And the issues of the trade war, which Trump himself actually started, became uninteresting to him, and some scheduled negotiations were simply quietly cancelled. So he came for trade, started this whole mess with the trade war himself, and then says, "Listen, I'm already bored discussing this, let's just cancel everything, I don't want to talk about it." French President Emmanuel Macron called Trump's early departure a positive sign, stating that a proposal was made, quote, to achieve a ceasefire and then begin broader negotiations between Iran and Israel. And here Donald Trump didn't stay silent and for some reason said that Macron is, quote, a publicity-seeking guy who was misinformed, end quote from Trump. Whether intentionally or not, Emmanuel is always wrong. Why this was even said remains a mystery. And finally, I'll add a telling moment that demonstrates Donald Trump's real attitude toward Russia's war against Ukraine. When Trump was already leaving Canada, a plane carrying Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky was just landing there. The two leaders had a meeting scheduled, but Trump simply flew to Washington without any explanation. And as we saw, even the meeting in the White House Situation Room took place almost a day after he left Canada, where the summit was held. So, as they say, draw your own conclusions and write them in the comments under this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like.